So our next colleague presenter is Daniel Casasanto, who is new to us but not to the field. He's in human development. Daniel did his undergraduate work at Oberlin, where he had, I guess, a double major in English literature and voice, and was for 10 years or so an opera singer. He then found his way to MIT, where he got a PhD in brain and cognitive sciences. After that, a postdoc at Stanford, by the way, where he joined a singing group called the Dead Tongues in the linguistics group. After that, appointments at Chicago, at the New School in Chicago, and that's what brought you here.
Exactly.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So this is a quick peek at some research exploring how space provides an invisible scaffold for our thoughts, feelings, judgments. What do I mean by space? Well, this is a shameless bait and switch. I know nothing about this kind of space. I wish I did. What I mean is this kind of space, the kind of space within and around our bodies, the space that is the medium for our interaction with the physical and the social environment. So I got interested in this because decades ago, linguists started making claims about how we can't help but talk about lots of non-spatial domains of knowledge using spatial language. We talk about a long time, a high price, a deep mystery, a close friendship, et cetera, et cetera. And we can hardly avoid these kinds of expressions. And linguists were suggesting that these expressions in language, the linguistic metaphors, suggest something deep about the nature of our concepts. Well, a lot of psychologists were skeptical about this, and I was one of them. And I set out as a graduate student to debunk these claims about metaphorical thinking beyond metaphorical language. And I failed pretty miserably over a period of over a decade now. We started doing experiments to find out whether people are really using space for thinking about non-spatial domains with really simple experiments. You'd see words either close or far on the screen, right? And for each pair of words, you would judge how similar they were in meaning. And the idea was that as if we think about similarity the way we talk about it, that close is more similar, far is more dissimilar, then we should see this reflected in the data. Indeed, we do. We see that people judge the same pair of words to be more similar in meaning if they encounter them closer together in space. The same is true if you take language out of the picture entirely. You do low-level psychophysical tasks. Whoops, these are out of order. This is the results for judgments of word meanings presented close, medium, or far for the same words. You see the same thing if you take language out of the picture entirely and ask people to do low-level psychophysical tasks, reproducing the pitch of a tone, or in this case, the length of a line. People can't help but incorporate space into their judgments. If a line travels farther on the screen, they think that it took longer in time, all else being equal. These patterns are very are visible early, so we have lots of expressions in language about good is up and bad is down. You can see in preschoolers that already, if you ask them which of these kitties is nicer or meaner or dumber or smarter, they attribute the more positive valence qualities to the animal that's on top. More negative to the ones that's on bottom. Just a few from examples from lots of examples that we have now. Very quickly, I want to address two questions. Where do these mental metaphors beyond language, where do these metaphors in our thinking come from? And what might some implications be for judgment and decision making? Well, where they come from was a real puzzle. There are two communities that pretty much ignore each other and have put forth two different theories, not necessarily incompatible, but one could be right and the other's not. Especially case by case. The first is that, of course, we come to conceptualize things spatially because of the way we interact with the spatial environment using our bodies. So, for example, this good is up and bad is down we get by generalizing from this universal, supposedly, pattern that we stand erect when we feel good and we slump down when we feel bad, right? But another community says, hey, look, people don't have to discover this relationship between space and valence on their own. It's present in linguistic and cultural conventions. We can't help using good is up and bad is down language. So learners could get these mental metaphors via language. How do we find out? The problem is that for this, which is the nicer or smarter kitty experiment and just about any other that you could propose, these two theories make the same prediction. We found a test bed where we could distinguish them, however, and this is a different spatial mapping of emotional valence. in language and across many cultures, we associate good with the right and bad with the left. It's sort of a wimpy association in our culture. It's very stringent in other cultures where you're told, for example, that you eat with your right hand because only Satan eats with his left hand. Why? What is this telling us about the way people conceptualize good and bad things? Well, here's an idea. Maybe across cultures, good is associated with right because most people are right-handed. Why would this matter? Well, because we can interact with our environment more fluently on the right side of space. Lots of research shows that fluency, all else being equal, leads to liking. We like stuff better that we can interact with more fluently, perceptually or motorically. Now, if that's true, if bodily interactions with the environment are the basis for these patterns in language and culture, and these patterns in language and culture are telling us about the way we conceptualize good and bad stuff in space, then we can find out whether this idea is on the right track by looking at left-handers. Here's the cool thing. We can disentangle the possible origins of these mental metaphors by comparing lefties and righties. If linguistic and cultural experience is responsible for these spatial mappings in our head, then everybody should think that good is right and bad is left. Why? Because regardless of your handedness, everyone has to talk and act like a righty, right? It's a right-handed world. We have to shake hands with our right hand, right? Lefties don't get to shake with their left hand. They don't get to say that the correct answer is the left answer, right? That would be really confusing. However, if we have these spatial mappings in our mind and they're based on the specifics of the way we interact with the environment using our bodies, then righties should think that right is good. Well, that's uninformative. Lefties should think that left is good implicitly, in spite of everything that language and culture is telling them. How do we find out? Well, there are now dozens of experiments. They started out very silly. We sent people to the planet Fribalia and asked them to make judgments about the fribbles, the inhabitants. Which of these fribbles looks more or less intelligent, more or less happy or honest or attractive? Circle the one that you would choose for each of these positive or negative attributes. And of course, you counterbalance the position of the fribbles so that even if you've convinced yourself this is simply a more intelligent looking fribble, that couldn't explain the results, which show that on average, righties attribute more positive qualities to the fribble on the right, lefties to the fribble on the left, for these attributes like honesty that are not obviously related to the way we use our hands to interact with the environment. Same here on planet Earth. We send people on a shopping spree for each pair of products that you see described. Choose which one you would buy, X out the one that you wouldn't buy, so you're making marks on the both sides of the page, counterbalance the circling and the Xing. Other questionnaire, this is really important. You're the boss. You decide who gets the job. Is it the programmer who programs in Python or in Perl, right? And on average, perhaps frighteningly enough, lefties are more likely to choose the person or the product on their left, righties the person or product on their right. Now, this is potentially interesting because it can explain some of the foundational findings in what we now know as judgment and decision making, right? Remember the stocking study? Wilson and Nisbet, 1978? They sprayed aromas on 4 different stockings, right, counterbalancing their order, and had people choose which was the highest quality stocking. Well, the odors made absolutely no difference. What made a difference was how far to the right in serial order the stocking was. This was totally unpredicted. The researchers said, we don't know what this is about, but we think it's probably about either numerical or temporal order. Well, now we can look back at these data and say, hey, maybe it wasn't about numbers or time, maybe it was about space, and probably about 90% of their subjects were right-handers. Does this have implications for real-world decision-making? Well, that's an interesting question that it would be fun to discuss. We're often faced with more or less interchangeable options in everyday situations, like standing in front of the drugstore or grocery store shelves. Sometimes we're making decisions under time pressure, right? The server is about to come over. What do you choose? I don't know, but if I were the restaurant owner, I know where I would put the lobster, given these data. We do have one data point on a decision that could really matter. Along with John Krosnick, a ballot design expert at Stanford, we did a study testing for the first time left-right dimensions of ballot design. So there are hundreds of studies on top-to-bottom ballot design. Again, everybody thought that the top of ballot advantage was about numerical or temporal order, right? Well, what about space? it turns out that in the voting booth or on the ballot, there are often columns, left-right columns of candidates. In a large random dial survey, over a million people were dialed, a few hundred replied, and they saw candidates' names arrayed top, bottom, or left, right. The lefties were about 15 percentage points more likely to say they'd vote for the candidate they saw on the left of the ballot. So it's small in effect size, but these things could add up. And I would welcome your thoughts about how this kind of work is relevant to judgment and decision making. Thank you. Katie.
Thanks, Daniel. I imagine this was counterbalanced, but I was just wondering, in your choosing studies, half the time were they looking for which creature is more dishonest, or which product would you return?
Yep.
And does that matter?
Yeah, so you always balance in the product one, we didn't, so we counterbalanced whether you're Xing it out first or circling first, right? So choosing the, first you respond to the one that you don't want. And in the other one, we counterbalance the polarity of the question, which one is more honest versus which one is less honest. So that means that if you're a righty and you prefer the one on the right, you have to choose the one on the left.
And that doesn't matter at all?
Nope. It wouldn't be surprising if there were markedness effects overlaid on this, but you can see these despite counterbalancing. Please.
Here's a question. I'm just wondering if you doing this survey and you make a lefty to use a pen in his right hand and then do the survey, will that be different in this survey? Because I just wondering if this is related to the habit of lefties and righties, or just related to the physical space, just in which hand he holds his pen.
We don't know the answer to that question if you make a lefty hold the pen in the wrong hand. We do know that you can experimentally determine which hand is more motorically fluent. And we do this by bringing people into the lab, and instead of testing them based on their natural handedness, we intervene. We give them a fine motor task for a few minutes where they have a big bulky ski glove on either one hand or the other. So they experience either their usual motor asymmetry exaggerated or the opposite motor asymmetry. Then we take the hand off and we test their implicit left-right preferences. We find that after even a short intervention, you can, people's choices will follow their functional handedness. We can see this longer term with stroke patients who've lost the use of one hand. Their preferences go with their post-stroke motor dominance, not with their natural motor dominance. Please.
Have you looked at like ambidextrous people?
So we're all a little bit ambidextrous. So I was presenting sort of the simplest, clearest cases where you pretend that handedness is binary. Handedness is in fact a continuum. What we find is that for subtler tasks with more continuous dBs, like reaction times, that you find stronger reaction time effects one way or the other, depending upon both the direction and the degree of people's handedness. So for people in the middle of the spectrum, you don't find much preference one way or the other.
Mike?
So perhaps one other option is maybe it doesn't have anything to do with space or motor actions. Maybe it just has to do with people associating themselves with the word right versus the word left. So I wonder if in the political spectrum you have people who are rightists and who are leftists. I wonder if you might find similar results there, and if that's the case, or maybe you find results consistent with the hypothesis, it doesn't exist there, which would be nice for your street.
Yeah, so the interventions tell us that it's not about your identity. So this is something that a lot of people are interested in. So lefties today, although left-handedness was condemned throughout much of history and still throughout much of the world, now it's sort of a point of pride, right? Lefties are associated with genius and creativity. It's not about left-handed identity, because if we put a ski glove on a righty for 12 minutes, we can make them respond just like a lefty. And same for the stroke patients. Is there an association, so politics is mapped to the same left-right dimension. Do these mental metaphors that share the same source domain mess with each other? So for example, are lefties more likely to vote left, right? We have asked this question sort of in the background of ongoing questionnaire research, and so far don't have any evidence that that's the case. It would be very cool if it were.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.